When it comes to the iconic guitar techniques used by the most legendary guitarists of all time, you very likely associate one or a few players to each of the most distinct techniques. However, the story behind these techniques often stretches back further than the names we typically associate with them. Many of the most innovative ideas in guitar playing were developed by lesser-known players long before they became mainstream. These early innovators experimented, refined, and in some cases completely redefined what the guitar could do, and eventually left it to the more popular guitarists to bring to the mainstream. Let's take a look at some of the most surprising. Guitarists like Yngwie Malmsteen, Eddie Van Halen, or Joe Satriani likely come to mind when you think of sweep picking. Among other guitarists in the 80s, they popularized sweep picking alongside the neoclassical shredding style, which came to the forefront in the 80s. However, sweep picking was used in the 70s by rock guitarists Ritchie Blackmore and Steve Hackett. They both utilized the technique in their progressive rock and heavy metal solos. Hackett's innovative approach on Genesis tracks like Dancing with the Moonlit Night showcased the technique's melodic potential, while Ritchie Blackmore's work with Deep Purple highlighted its speed and precision, setting a foundation for the next generation of players. But to get to the true origin of sweep picking, you have to go all the way back to the 1950s, where famed solid-body guitar inventor Les Paul and country-style guitarist Chet Atkins used the technique in their playing. Back then, it was used as a way to be fluid in their jazz and country phrasing. Obviously, the technique evolved a lot from there, as it is now directly associated with the shredding style, and guitarists in genres like metal or progressive rock. The evolution of sweep picking as a core element of shredding can be largely credited to players like Yngwie Malmsteen in the 1980s, who fused classical music influences with speed and precision. But the invention still came long before it was popularized in the 1980s. When most people think of tapping, the name Eddie Van Halen instantly comes to mind. His iconic solo in Eruption revolutionized the way we hear and see tapping on the guitar. But Eddie himself acknowledged he wasn't the first to use this technique. In an interview, he cited being inspired to do two-handed tapping from watching Jimmy Page play a solo where he went hands-free and continuously hammered on. This gave him the idea to use his other hand to essentially move up the nut. Before Eddie Van Halen, Steve Hackett from Genesis was experimenting with tapping in the early 70s. His influence on the development of tapping is widely recognized by guitar historians. And even before Steve Hackett, guitarists like Emmett Chapman and Harvey Mandel were using similar ideas with two-handed hammer-ons and pull-offs to achieve a more rapid note sequence, all the way back in the late 60s and early 70s. Some even credit earlier blues players who used very basic forms of tapping in their solos. Of course, not like we saw players like Eddie Van Halen do, so perhaps his credit is justified as he used it in a way that truly changed the game. Not just as a mid-solo trick, but to create long melodies and catchy patterns. One of the more wild stage moves is when a guitarist plays with their teeth, using them to pluck the strings. Of course, Jimi Hendrix was famous for doing this. Hendrix has stated that he wanted to pull out more stage antics like this just to impress women. It was this kind of playing that ultimately got him fired from some of the bands he was in early on in his career. While Hendrix is of course most commonly associated with this technique, it was actually T-Bone Walker who cultivated this technique in the 40s and 50s. Then, later on, Hendrix brought it to some of the biggest performances of his career, and of course it became legendary, as the move was now associated with arguably the greatest guitarist to ever live. Another classic stage move is playing the guitar behind your head or back. When you think of this move, I'd be willing to bet that one of these two guitarists come to mind, Stevie Ray Vaughan or Jimi Hendrix. As they should, because they've certainly brought it to the mainstream for generations to come. But long before Stevie and Jimmy were using this technique, it was actually used all the way back in the 40s, again by blues legend T-Bone Walker. The fact that he pioneered this technique adds to his impressive resume of being an electric guitar innovator. Steve Miller also claims that in 1952, when he was about 8, T-Bone Walker taught him how to play behind the back. This checks out as he was a family friend and frequent visitor of the Miller family. Unlike sweep picking, legato is a technique that involves smoothly and continuously playing notes consecutively, with a more percussive alternative picking style. Legato has been used by many guitarists throughout guitar history, but guitarists like Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, or Eddie Van Halen are the ones commonly associated with innovating and popularizing that style of playing into the mainstream. But before they came along, British jazz guitarist Alan Holdsworth utilized this technique. He had immense skill at identifying patterns on the fretboard. That, along with his abnormally large hands, allowed him to play a smooth legato that achieved a flow of notes that was not seen before him. Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, and Eddie Van Halen, the guys who popularized this technique, have referenced Holdsworth as one of the greatest guitarists to ever live. Controlled feedback is definitely a less flashy guitar trick, but still is used among some of the greatest guitar players ever. Notably, Jimi Hendrix popularized this technique, which involves a crafted combination of distortion and fuzz and distance from the amp. This was a staple of his innovative playing. However, Hendrix was actually not the first to employ this technique. Early blues and rock guitarists like Willie Johnson, Johnny Watson, and Link Wray pioneered the use of acoustic feedback in their performances. The first time that it was used in a recorded song was in I Feel Fine by the Beatles in 1964. This technique went on to be used by other guitar legends like Jeff Beck, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Pete Townsend, and countless other modern-day guitarists. So there you have it. Those are a few popular guitar techniques and stage tricks that might not have originated from the person you thought. Hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.